The lioness staggered through the heat-struck savanna, her golden coat dulled by dust and blood. The sun poured down mercilessly, bleaching the grass into brittle straw, and each step she took pressed her deeper into exhaustion. Her paws trembled, her flanks heaved, and her eyes, once sharp with a predator's fire, were dimmed by fatigue. Yet she pushed on. She had no choice. 2 cubs trailed behind her, limping, broken things that should have been thriving bundles of muscle and mischief. One had deep scratches carved into his side, a wound festering with infection. The other dragged a hind leg that hung useless, bone fractured from the snapping jaws of a hyena. Both cried weakly, their voices thin, wavering, as if even sound had abandoned them. 2 nights ago, it had all happened. A cackle of hyenas had descended under cover of darkness, their eyes gleaming like coals, their laughter splitting the night. The lioness had fought savagely, claws raking, teeth tearing, her roars echoing across the grassland. She had saved her cubs, but barely. She had paid for it with slashed flesh and drained strength. Since then, she had not eaten. Every ounce of her being had gone into moving forward, into finding some place where her cubs might live another day. But where? The savannah held no mercy. The vultures circling above knew that well. By midday, her path brought her to a place she had never intended to go, the border of a village. She knew the scent of man, the acrid smoke of fires, the bitter tang of iron tools. Normally, she would avoid it. Humans meant danger. But something inside her, an instinct or perhaps something more, pulled her forward. The night before, in a shallow sleep, she had seen something. A figure. Tall, draped in white and blue, with eyes that glowed like the moon. The figure had stood utterly still, hands open as if waiting. The lioness had not understood it, yet she could not shake it from her mind. Now, though she did not know why, her paws carried her toward it. The village stirred as she approached. Farmers in the fields dropped their tools. Children were scooped up and rushed inside huts. Men shouted warnings, grabbing spears and sticks, their hearts thundering in their chests. A lioness entering the heart of their world was unthinkable. But something was different. She was not prowling, not hunting. She was stumbling. And her eyes, wild, golden, desperate, were fixed not on them but on the center of the square. There stood the statue. It rose tall, carved from pale stone, its surface weathered by sun and rain but still bearing a serene beauty. The Virgin Mary, arms outstretched, gazed with quiet compassion upon the village she had watched over for decades. At her feet, villagers had left offerings, candles, flowers, small bundles of grain. Her marble face bore the patience of centuries, the silence of faith. The lioness collapsed before her. The sound of her body hitting the ground sent a jolt through the air, but no villager moved. Dust billowed, the cubs tumbled beside her, whimpering pitifully. And then the lioness did something no one had ever imagined. She pressed her head against the base of the statue. A low, guttural moan tore from her chest. Not a roar. Not a growl. Something closer to a sob. Her flanks quivered, her body shook, and she nudged her injured cub forward, as though offering him. The crowd, frozen, felt the world tilt. A beast of the wild was begging. Gasps rippled among the villagers. Mothers clutched their rosaries. An elder woman whispered, "Madonna," as if her voice alone might awaken something sacred. Children peeked from doorways with wide eyes, seeing the lioness not as terror but as tragedy. The lioness lifted her gaze, golden eyes shimmering with pain, and let out another cry that chilled the bones of everyone present. She was asking, pleading, praying in the only way she could. Then, silence. A breeze rose out of nowhere, gentle but cool, though the afternoon was sweltering. The flames of the candles flickered but did not extinguish. And for a breathless moment, the villagers swore the marble eyes of the Virgin glimmered, as if touched by life. The scent of roses filled the air. Impossible in that dry, dusty place, yet undeniable. The cub with the broken leg stirred. Its weak whimpers grew louder. Slowly, shakily, it pressed its paw to the ground and rose. The limb that had hung limp now bore its weight. It stood without falling. A cry erupted from the villagers. Some dropped to their knees, others clutched one another, weeping. "A miracle!" someone shouted, and the word passed from mouth to mouth like fire. The lioness licked her cubs with frantic devotion, pulling them close. Their wounds, still raw, no longer festered. The swelling eased before the villagers' eyes. Their tiny bodies, moments ago fragile and on the edge of death, seemed steadier, stronger. One by one, the villagers dropped to their knees before the statue too, whispering prayers, their voices tangled with sobs. They had seen many things in their lives, drought, storms, famine, but never this. The lioness, her side still heaving, looked again at the Virgin's face. For a heartbeat, she held still, and in her animal soul, she knew her plea had been answered. She pressed her head once more to the statue's base, then lowered herself to the ground, trembling, eyes half closed. Her cubs pawed at her, nudging her, coaxing her to rise. For a moment, it seemed she would not. Her strength was gone. But then, her chest lifted with a long, deep breath. She opened her eyes, bright now, not dulled by fatigue but glowing with something almost regal. The lioness rose. The villagers gasped again. The creature who had dragged herself here moments ago looked changed. Not invincible, not fully healed, but transformed. She stood tall, proud, her gaze no longer clouded with despair. She gathered her cubs close. For a final moment, she lowered her head toward the Virgin Mary statue, as if in reverence. Then she turned, leading her little ones away, step by step, back toward the wild. The crowd did not move. Not until the lions disappeared into the tall grass. Only then did the dam burst. Voices rose, prayers poured out, tears streamed. The church bells rang, though no hand had touched them. From that day forward, the story spread. The village became a place of pilgrimage. Mothers carried sick children to kneel where the lioness had knelt. Farmers brought offerings, whispering their hopes for rain and harvest. And many swore that small miracles continued to happen at the statue's feet. Healings, protections, blessings. But perhaps the greatest shock came later, when hunters and travelers began to speak of a lioness roaming the ridges near the valley. She was unlike any other. Larger, stronger, with a faint pale streak across her brow, almost like a crown. She never preyed on livestock. She never came near homes. Instead, she was seen at night, watching silently from the hills, her grown cubs at her side. Some called her La Leona de Maria, the Lioness of Mary. And in the years that followed, when the wind swept softly through the fields, villagers swore they could hear it, the faint echo of a lioness's cry. Not of hunger, not of rage, but of prayer. In the days after the miracle, the village was never the same. At first, people whispered the story only among themselves, afraid that others would laugh, that the tale would sound too impossible. But it only took one trader passing through to hear the account and carry it to the next town. From there, like a flame catching dry grass, the story spread. A lioness with her dying cubs, they said, came to the Virgin Mary herself, and the statue gave life where death was certain. Some dismissed it as madness. Others scoffed, saying villagers in the back country were prone to superstition. But for every skeptic, there were 10 who believed. And soon they came. At first it was a trickle, an old woman with a walking stick, a mother carrying a child wrapped in cloth, a man leading a donkey laden with flowers. They knelt at the base of the statue, touching the very place where the lioness had pressed her head. They prayed. They wept. Some claimed their pain lifted instantly. A farmer with a twisted hand returned to his fields and plowed the next morning. A girl who had not spoken since illness as a child whispered her first words after kneeling there. The villagers who had witnessed it all swore these were not coincidences. They had seen with their own eyes the cub stand. They had smelled roses in the air where only dust had been. This was not a story, they said. This was truth. And as the seasons passed, the trickle became a river. Pilgrims arrived in long lines, carrying candles, paintings of the Virgin, and even small carved lions in honor of the beast who had prayed. The village, once quiet, became alive with prayers and chants. Merchants set up stalls selling rosaries. The church struggled to hold all who came, so many gathered outdoors, pressing into the square, waiting their turn to kneel at the statue's feet. The statue itself changed too, or so it seemed. Its stone face, once calm and still, now bore a softness that visitors swore had not been there before. Some said it was an illusion, others insisted it was the Virgin herself, pleased with the faith of her children. And always, at the base of the statue, offerings piled up, candles, coins, flowers, toys left by children, and prayers scribbled on scraps of paper. Yet through it all, one detail never faded: the lioness. The villagers began to speak of her as if she were a saint herself, an animal chosen to reveal the Virgin's mercy. They painted her in murals on the church walls, always with her cubs, always kneeling before the Holy Mother. They told their children the tale again and again until every boy and girl could recite it as easily as their prayers. And in the fields at night, when shadows moved across the ridges, people looked up and wondered if La Leona de Maria was watching them. Hunters confirmed she was real. They spotted her often but never dared harm her. Something about her presence was untouchable, sacred. One hunter who raised his rifle at her found his weapon misfired 3 times, though it had been oiled that very morning. Shaken, he swore he would never again point a gun at her. Instead, the lioness became protector of the valley. When jackals drew near livestock, she was seen chasing them off. When a leopard prowled too close, villagers woke to find its tracks leading away, as if driven by fear of something greater. She did not raid goats or cattle. She did not stalk the children who wandered too far from home. She was simply there, silent, watchful, and strange. Years passed, and the cubs grew into strong lions, males with thick manes and females fierce and proud. They hunted the hills, but never the village. Farmers began to believe their herds were safer than anywhere else in the region. They credited not fences, not luck, but the Lioness of Mary. Stories multiplied. A boy claimed he got lost in the fields and, as night fell, saw glowing eyes in the grass. He thought he was done for, but instead of an attack, the lioness circled him slowly and nudged him gently toward the village with her massive head until he found his way home. An old man swore he saw her standing before the statue again one moonlit night, head bowed as if in prayer. The legend became so strong that people from across the country traveled not only to see the statue, but to catch a glimpse of her. Pilgrims camped on the ridges, waiting for the shadow of a lion to pass against the stars. Sometimes they saw nothing. Other times, they swore they glimpsed her pale, streaked brow, gleaming like a crown, just for an instant, before she melted back into the tall grass. The church eventually sent priests to investigate. At first, they were cautious, suspecting exaggeration. But the sheer number of testimonies, the sheer faith that had grown in this once-forgotten village, made them pause. They could not declare miracles lightly, but neither could they deny what they heard. One priest, Father Ignacio, wrote in his journal, "I came skeptical. I leave humbled. I do not know if statues can heal. I do not know if beasts can pray. But I know what I saw in the faces of these people. I know the peace I felt when I knelt at the stone where the lioness laid her head. I smelled roses where there were none. I cannot explain it. Perhaps it needs no explanation." The story of the lioness became more than a local tale. It became a symbol. Priests across the country used it in sermons, teaching that even the fiercest of creatures, even the wildest, can bow before the Virgin in need. Mothers taught it to their children, reminding them that courage is not only in fighting, but in knowing when to ask for mercy. And always, the lioness herself lingered like a shadow over the story, part flesh, part myth. To some, she was a beast touched by divine grace. To others, she was proof that miracles wore many faces, sometimes human, sometimes animal. But for the villagers who had seen her collapse in dust, for those who had watched her cub rise and walk again, there was no doubt. She was chosen. And they would never forget the day the wild itself had come, trembling, to the Virgin Mary, and left transformed. Years became decades. The little village that had once been quiet and poor transformed into a place known far beyond its borders. Roads were built to handle the stream of pilgrims. Inns opened to house the faithful who came to pray where the lioness had prayed. Artists painted her image in churches across the land, a golden mother, eyes lifted in sorrow, cubs at her side, bowing before the Virgin Mary. But as with all miracles, stories grew and twisted. Some added details, claims that the lioness spoke in a voice like thunder, or that her cubs had been crowned in light. Others stripped the tale down to bare bones, simply a lioness who wandered, who by chance stopped at a statue, and villagers whose faith filled in the rest. Still, at the heart of it all remained the moment of truth, the sight of a mother who begged for her children, and something greater that answered. Generations of children grew up with the legend. They played at being cubs, limping to the statue, pretending to be healed. Mothers told the tale to hush crying infants, whispering, the Virgin heard even a lioness's cry. She will hear yours too. And always, somewhere out in the wild, there were reports, distant, fading, of a great lioness's descendants still roaming, a line unbroken since the day of the miracle. But every legend faces its trial. It came one dry season when the rains failed. The fields cracked, the wells ran low, and cattle began to collapse in the dust. The villagers prayed, leaving offerings at the statue's feet until the stone was buried in flowers and wax. But the skies stayed empty. Fear crept in. The pilgrims slowed, some muttering that perhaps the miracles had ended, that faith was not enough. One evening, under a sky streaked with red, a storm of fire appeared, not of heaven, but of men. Poachers came. Armed with rifles, they had heard the old stories of lions roaming the valley. To them, such beasts were not sacred but trophies worth a fortune. Gunfire cracked across the hills. Villagers ran to hide, clutching their children. The poachers laughed, advancing deeper into the land, leaving only smoke behind. And in the distance, over the dry ridges, came a sound none had heard in years, a lion's roar. It rolled across the fields like thunder, deep and furious. The poachers froze. Another roar followed, closer this time, shaking the air. Out from the tall grass came shapes, several lions, manes bristling, eyes blazing. They were not prowling for prey. They were charging. The poachers raised their rifles, firing wildly. Bullets split the air. Dust rose. Villagers screamed. And yet, through it all, the lions kept coming. At their front was one lioness, not young, not sleek, her coat scarred, her pace slower, but her head was high. Across her brow was a streak of pale fur, gleaming in the dying sun. "La Leona de Maria!" cried an old woman watching from her doorway. The poachers faltered. Shots rang, but several rifles jammed, misfiring again and again. Panic spread among them. And then the lions were upon them, not killing, not feasting, but scattering them, driving them like terrified prey into the bush until they fled and did not return. The villagers poured into the square, stunned, shaken, alive. The lions did not linger to attack them. They stopped at the statue instead. The scarred lioness, breathing hard, stepped forward. She lowered her head, just as the one before her had done generations earlier, pressing her brow to the base of the Virgin Mary. For a long moment she stayed there, silent, while the villagers fell to their knees in awe. Then, with a final low rumble that sounded almost like a sigh, she turned and led her pride back into the grasslands. That night, clouds gathered. Lightning split the horizon, and rain, real, heavy, soaking rain, poured onto the cracked earth. Wells filled. Fields softened. The drought ended. And no villager doubted what they had seen. The lioness had returned when they needed her most. From that day, the story of La Leona de Maria deepened. She was not just the lioness who once begged. She was the protector, the reminder, the guardian who returned when faith wavered and danger rose. Her tale was no longer simply about cubs saved, but about a people saved too. Time moved on, as it always does. The lions themselves faded from the land, their roars becoming rarer each passing decade. But the legend never died. Even when the last lion was gone from the valley, parents still told the tale to their children. Pilgrims still came. And the statue, weathered but unbroken, still stood with arms outstretched, still bearing the marks of a lioness's head pressed into its stone. Centuries later, scholars would argue about it. Was it possible? Did a lioness truly kneel? Could a statue truly glow? Could wounds heal? Some dismissed it as myth. Others clung to it as faith. But for the villagers, and for countless pilgrims who had knelt at that stone, there was no debate. For faith is not built on what can be measured. It is built on what is felt. And those who had smelled roses in the dust, who had seen eyes glow in the grass, who had heard a roar shake the sky, needed no proof beyond their own hearts. They knew the truth. The lioness had begged. The Virgin had answered. And the world, just for a moment, had seen mercy flow through the wild. Even now, on quiet nights when the stars blaze and the fields whisper with wind, some swear they hear it, the faint sound of a lioness's cry, carried across the valley. Not a roar of hunger, not a growl of rage, but something softer, something closer to prayer. And in that sound lives the memory of a mother who once laid her sorrow at the feet of the Virgin Mary, and left with hope, with healing, and with a miracle that no one could ever forget.